In a small town filled with corruption, cops burns a black person house in front of him and they don't realize he's the sheriff. As Tom tries to uncover the truth, he finds himself in grave danger. Will he get justice before it's too late? But before, tell us in comments where you are watching from and like and subscribe to fight against the racism and corruption. Leave a comment and we will feature the best one in our next videos. The evening was supposed to be a peaceful one for Sheriff Tom Lawson. He had spent the day handling the usual duties around town, breaking up a few small disputes, patrolling the streets, and handling paperwork back at the station. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but Tom was looking forward to some rest after a long week. As he drove down the old country road that led to his home, he noticed a strange glow in the sky. At first, Tom thought it was the sunset casting an unusual hue over the horizon, but the color was too intense. Deep oranges and flickering reds that sent a shiver down his spine. Something was wrong. His heart began to race as he pushed his truck to go faster. The road twisted through the woods, and soon enough, the source of the glow came into view. Tom's house was on fire. Flames licked at the sky, devouring the wooden walls and engulfing the porch in a thick cloud of smoke. His home, where he had lived for years, was crumbling before his very eyes. But what was even more shocking was the group of uniformed police officers standing just outside the perimeter, casually watching the fire burn. Tom slammed his brakes and jumped out of the truck, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He rushed toward the officers, unable to believe what he was seeing. "What the hell is going on?" Tom shouted, his voice breaking with panic and confusion. "Why aren't you doing anything to stop this?" One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, turned to him with a blank expression. He didn't seem alarmed by the sheriff's presence, nor did he seem concerned about the fire. The man simply shrugged, as if it wasn't his problem. "Move along, sir. This isn't your concern," the officer said coldly. Tom blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. He knew these men. They were his colleagues, police officers from his own department, men he had worked alongside for years. But none of them were making any move to help. They stood there, arms crossed, watching the flames like it was just another day on the job. "Not my concern. That's my house," Tom shouted, his voice hoarse. "What the hell are you doing just standing there? Get the fire department. Get some water. Do something." The officer's face remained impassive. "Sir, I need you to step back. You're interfering with official business." Tom's blood ran cold. What was he talking about? He was the sheriff. This was his home. He had every right to be here, and these men were supposed to be helping him, not standing around as his life went up in flames. "I'm Sheriff Tom Lawson," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though anger was bubbling inside him. "I'm ordering you to get some help here before this whole place burns down." The officer smirked, a twisted grin that sent chills down Tom's spine. "Sheriff, huh? Never heard of you," he said, his tone mocking. "Now, I'm only going to say this one more time. Step back before things get worse for you." Tom felt like he'd been punched in the gut. These officers, his officers, were acting like they didn't even know him. He opened his mouth to argue again, but the sight of more flames tearing through his house stole the words from his throat. The fire was spreading fast, too fast. Soon, the roof would collapse, and everything inside would be lost. He glanced at the other officers, hoping one of them might step forward, might recognize him, might offer some explanation for this madness. But none of them moved. They stood in silence, eyes fixed on the burning house, as if it were some spectacle they had come to watch for entertainment. "Why are you doing this?" Tom asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "You know who I am. You know this is wrong." No one answered. The only sound was the crackling of the fire as it consumed everything Tom had worked for, everything he cared about. The smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating, and the heat from the blaze was unbearable. But the officers remained unmoved, their faces unreadable, like they were following some unseen command. Tom stepped back, his mind reeling. His home was being destroyed right in front of him, and the men who should have been helping were acting like strangers. No, worse than strangers. They were deliberately letting it happen. But why? What had changed? Why didn't they recognize him? His heart pounded in his chest as he considered the possibility that this wasn't just some terrible accident. This was intentional. Someone had ordered this. Someone had decided to burn his house, and these officers had been told to stand by and watch. But who would do something like that? And why? As the roof of his house collapsed with a loud crash, sending sparks flying into the night sky, Tom knew one thing for certain. This was no mistake. Someone wanted to destroy him, and they had used the very people he trusted to do it. But who? And why? Tom turned back to the group of officers, his eyes narrowing as he took in their cold, indifferent stares. Something was terribly wrong here, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. But for now, all he could do was watch as the flames consumed what was left of his home, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. And as the fire roared louder, casting an eerie glow over the surrounding woods, Tom made a silent vow. Whoever had done this, whoever had ordered the destruction of his life, would pay. He didn't know why they had targeted him, but he would find out. He would uncover the truth, no matter how deep or dark the conspiracy ran. But for now, all he could do was stand there, helpless, as his home turned to ash before his very eyes. Tom Lawson stood frozen as the last pieces of his home crumbled into the roaring flames. The crackling of burning wood filled his ears, the heat pushing him further back from the wreckage. His heart pounded furiously in his chest, and his thoughts raced wildly. How could this be happening? How could these officers, men who should have known him well, just stand there and let his home be destroyed? Steeling himself, Tom turned his gaze back to the group of officers. They still stood there, casually watching the fire, their faces emotionless. They weren't making any moves to help. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him to back down, to leave. But Tom wasn't about to let that happen. He strode forward, ignoring the heat, ignoring the devastation, and marched straight up to the officer who had spoken to him earlier, the tall, grim-faced man who had dismissed him like a stranger. Tom stood only a few feet away from him now, his eyes blazing with fury. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing here," Tom growled, his voice low and menacing. "But this is my home. I'm the sheriff of this town, and I demand to know who gave the order to stand by and let my house burn." The officer didn't flinch. He stared back at Tom with that same cold, unfeeling gaze, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Sheriff, huh?" the officer repeated, his tone mocking. "I already told you, I don't know any Sheriff Lawson. You need to move along." Tom's fists clenched at his sides. This couldn't be real. This man had worked under him for years. He had seen him at the station, briefed him before patrols, and even shared coffee with him in the break room. But now, it was as if Tom had been erased from their memories. "I don't have time for this nonsense," Tom spat, his patience wearing thin. "Who's in charge here? I want to speak to the officer in command." The tall officer raised an eyebrow, his expression still taunting. He didn't seem the least bit intimidated by Tom's demand. "You're looking at him." Tom took a deep breath, trying to control the surge of frustration that was threatening to boil over. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This man wasn't acting on his own. Someone had put him in charge, someone higher up who had given the orders to let this fire rage unchecked. "Listen," Tom said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I don't know what kind of orders you've been given, but this is going too far. My home, everything I own, is in there, and you're just standing here watching it burn. I'm going to the station to sort this out, and when I do, you'll be answering for this. All of you will." The officer shrugged, unimpressed by the threat. "Do what you need to do, old man. But I'm telling you, no one's gonna back you up on this. You should just leave it alone before things get worse." Tom's eyes narrowed at the officer's words. There it was again, that veiled threat. Before things get worse. What did that even mean? And why was this man so sure that no one would support him? This was his town. He was the sheriff, the highest law enforcement officer in the area. How could they act like he didn't exist? "Are you threatening me?" Tom asked, his voice cold and sharp. The officer grinned, showing his teeth. "Just giving you some friendly advice, Sheriff." For a moment, Tom considered lunging at the man, grabbing him by the collar and demanding the truth. but he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. There were too many of them, 5 officers in total, and something told him they were waiting for him to make the first move. They wanted him to get angry, to act out. It was part of whatever game they were playing. So, instead, Tom took a step back, his jaw clenched. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, his voice filled with the promise of retribution. "All of you." The officer chuckled, but Tom turned on his heel and walked back toward his truck. His heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't from panic. It was from pure rage. He would get to the bottom of this. He didn't know why they were pretending not to know him, but he would find out. Someone, somewhere, had ordered this, and when he uncovered who it was, they would pay dearly. As he got into his truck, he glanced back at the burning wreckage of his home. His throat tightened at the sight. Years of memories were turning to ash before his eyes. Photos, mementos, everything he and his late wife had built together. Gone. And for what? Some twisted power play by the people he thought he could trust. Tom slammed the truck door shut and started the engine. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The fire was still raging, but there was no saving the house. All he could do now was go to the station, confront the chief, and demand an explanation. The station wasn't far, just a 10-minute drive into town, and he would get there in record time. As he sped down the dark road, his mind raced. None of this made sense. Why would the officers act like they didn't know him? They had worked under him for years, some of them for nearly a decade, and who had ordered them to stand down while his house burned. The more Tom thought about it, the more he realized there was only one explanation. Someone was trying to erase him. Someone was trying to push him out of his position, and this fire was just the beginning. He couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread as he neared the station. What if the chief was in on it? What if the whole department had turned against him? It seemed impossible, but after what he had just witnessed, nothing seemed impossible anymore. Pulling into the station parking lot, Tom felt a knot form in his stomach. The building loomed before him, its familiar stone walls now seeming more like the walls of a fortress, keeping him out rather than welcoming him in. Tom stepped out of his truck and marched up to the entrance, pushing open the heavy glass doors. Inside, the station was quiet. A few officers milled about, but when they saw Tom, their conversations stopped and they exchanged strange, knowing glances. Tom's unease grew with every step. He made a beeline for the chief's office, his boots echoing in the empty hallway. When he reached the door, he didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. Chief Harold Miller looked up from his desk, his face impassive. He didn't seem surprised to see Tom storming in, and that only made Tom angrier. "Harold, what the hell is going on?" Tom demanded, his voice shaking with frustration. "My house is burning to the ground, and your men are just standing there watching it. What are you playing at?" Chief Miller leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. His eyes were cold, distant, and Tom's stomach churned as he realized that something was very, very wrong. "Tom," the chief said slowly, his tone almost bored, "I think you need to take a step back and think about this carefully." Tom stared at him, the realization dawning like a thunderclap. They were all in on it. Tom stood frozen in Chief Harold Miller's office, his mind struggling to catch up with the situation. The chief had always been a steady presence, a mentor even, but now there was something chillingly different about him. The way he sat back in his chair, relaxed, almost disinterested, sent a wave of dread through Tom's chest. There was no urgency, no surprise. Miller's eyes, cold and calculating, stared back at him, waiting. Tom's voice came out strained, but firm. "What exactly am I supposed to think about, Harold? My house is burning. Your officers are standing there like they're at a barbecue, and no one's lifting a finger to help. You're going to tell me what's going on." Miller sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as if Tom's words were nothing but a minor inconvenience. "Tom, you're walking into something that's much bigger than you realize. Trust me, this isn't a situation you want to push." His voice was calm, measured, as if he were offering friendly advice rather than a warning. Tom stepped forward, gripping the back of the chair in front of Miller's desk. His knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. bigger than me? My home is gone. My life is in ruins, and your men are pretending like I don't even exist. I'm the sheriff of this town, Harold, and I demand answers." Miller's lips twitched, almost forming a smirk, but he kept his composure. "That's the thing, Tom. Maybe you were the sheriff. Maybe you think you still are. But there are other forces at work here, things you don't understand, things that don't follow the rules you're used to." Tom's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning he didn't want to acknowledge. He leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "What the hell are you talking about? What forces?" Miller leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "You've been the sheriff for a long time, Tom. You've kept your head down, did your job. But you're naive if you think everyone in this town is playing by the same rules. There are people with power here, people you don't see, who pull the strings from behind the scenes. And right now, they've decided that you're no longer needed." Tom stared at him, disbelief washing over him like ice-cold water. "What? You're saying this is about me? About getting rid of me? Why? I've done nothing but serve this town with integrity." Miller shrugged, a small, cold smile curling his lips. "It's not personal, Tom. It's just business. Someone decided you were a problem. Maybe you got too close to something you weren't supposed to. Maybe you've just been in your seat too long, and they want someone new. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you step aside quietly. Walk away. Things will be easier for you." Tom's grip tightened on the chair, his pulse thundering in his ears. Everything Miller was saying sounded like some kind of nightmare, a twisted game where the rules didn't apply to him anymore. But it was real. He could feel it in every word, every dismissive glance Miller threw his way. "And if I don't step aside?" Tom asked, his voice a low growl. He already knew the answer, but he had to hear it. He had to know just how deep this betrayal went. Miller's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "Then things get worse for you. Much worse. You've already seen a taste of what can happen, haven't you? Your house is gone, Tom. Your life as you knew it is gone. But that's just the beginning. If you keep pushing, if you keep demanding answers where there are none, you'll lose more than just your home." Tom's stomach churned. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a bottomless pit. Everything he had believed in, everything he had fought for, was crumbling beneath him. The town he had sworn to protect was being controlled by forces he didn't even know existed, and the very people he had trusted were part of it. For a moment, Tom didn't say anything. He simply stared at Miller, trying to process the depth of the betrayal. It was like a punch to the gut, one he hadn't seen coming, even after all these years in law enforcement. He had always thought corruption was something that happened in other places, to other people. Not here, not in his town, not to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less filled with resolve. "I'm not walking away, Harold. I'm not stepping aside for whoever's pulling your strings. I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going to be scared off by some shadowy threats. I'm the sheriff, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this." Miller's expression didn't change. If anything, the calmness in his face seemed to deepen, like he had expected Tom's response all along. "You're making a mistake, Tom. One that you won't be able to come back from." Tom straightened up, turning toward the door. He felt sick, betrayed, and furious. But there was a sliver of clarity now, a purpose cutting through the haze of confusion. He had to dig deeper, find out who was behind this, and why they wanted him out of the way. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. "I'll take my chances," Tom said over his shoulder before stepping out of the office. As he walked down the station's hallway, he felt the eyes of the officers on him. Some looked at him with confusion, others with something colder, resentment, or maybe pity. They all knew something Tom had been kept in the dark about for too long. Outside, the night was eerily quiet, the cool air doing little to calm the burning fury inside him. His home was gone. His trust in the people around him was shattered. But if there was one thing Tom had learned over the years, it was that justice didn't come easy. He would have to fight for it. And fight, he would. As he drove away from the station, his thoughts swirled. Who were these people Miller had hinted at? Who was powerful enough to orchestrate something like this? to burn his house, to erase his very identity. Tom knew he would have to dig into places he had never ventured before. He would have to find allies he could trust, if there were any left. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it would become. But Tom had already lost everything, and if they thought that would be enough to make him walk away, they didn't know him at all. They had made a terrible mistake, and Tom was about to make them regret it. The cool night air rushed through the open window of Tom's truck as he drove away from the station. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and betrayal. The realization that Chief Miller and the officers under his command had turned against him felt like a blow he hadn't seen coming. What gnawed at him most was the sense that this wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was part of something much bigger, something sinister happening behind the scenes. But who? And why? The headlights cut through the darkness as Tom drove aimlessly, trying to piece together the puzzle. Whoever was behind this had been careful, methodical. They had taken his home, stripped him of his authority, and erased his identity in a matter of hours. And now, they were daring him to fight back, knowing that he was alone. Alone. That word hit him harder than anything else. He had always prided himself on being the sheriff, the one person in town people could count on. Now, he couldn't even trust his own department. His allies had become strangers, enemies even, and that realization weighed heavy on him. If there was anyone left in this town who could help him, he needed to find them fast. Tom knew exactly where he had to go first. He turned down an old gravel road, the one that led to the outskirts of town, where the woods began to grow thick and wild. The road was bumpy, but Tom had driven this path so many times he could have done it blindfolded. At the end of the road stood a small, run-down house with a sagging roof and overgrown yard. Hank Mitchell lived here, a man who had once been one of Tom's most trusted deputies. Hank had retired a few years back, disillusioned with the way things were run in town, but Tom had always stayed in touch with him. He knew that if anyone still had his back, it would be Hank. Hank had always been wary of the politics in the department, and now Tom was beginning to see why. The truck's tires crunched over the gravel as Tom pulled up in front of the house. He killed the engine and stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the yard. Tom could see the faint glow of a TV through the front window. He knocked on the door, the sound heavy in the still night. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the door creaked open, and Hank stood there, his silhouette framed in the dim light. "Tom," Hank said, his voice gruff but surprised. "What the hell are you doing here at this hour?" Tom stepped forward, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching him. "I need your help, Hank. Something's happened. Something bad." Hank's eyes narrowed. He stepped aside, motioning for Tom to come in. "You'd better tell me everything." Inside, the house was as modest as Tom remembered, cluttered, but comfortable. Hank led him to the living room, where an old TV flickered in the corner, casting a dull glow over the room. Tom sat down on the worn-out couch while Hank grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and handed one to Tom before sitting across from him. "So, what's going on?" Hank asked, cracking open his beer. His eyes were sharp, focused, and Tom could tell he was already picking up on the tension in the air. Tom took a deep breath. "My house burned down, right in front of me." Hank raised an eyebrow. "What? How the hell?" "Here's the thing," Tom interrupted, his voice tight with emotion. "The fire wasn't an accident. My own officers stood there and watched it burn. They wouldn't help. They acted like they didn't even know me. And when I went to confront Chief Miller, he basically told me to walk away, like I was nothing, like they had already decided I was done." Hank leaned back in his chair, eyes widening in disbelief. "Miller said that?" Tom nodded. "He said there are people in this town pulling the strings, people with more power than we know, and they've decided I'm in the way. That's why they're doing this, Hank. They want me gone." Hank let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Damn, Tom. I always knew there was something rotten in that department. But this is on another level." Tom nodded grimly. "I need to figure out who's behind it, but I can't do it alone. I don't know who to trust anymore." Hank was quiet for a moment, staring down at his beer as he thought. Finally, he looked up, meeting Tom's eyes with a steady gaze. "You know I've got your back, Tom. Always have. But if what you're saying is true, you're going to be up against more than just Miller. Whoever's behind this, they've got real power. The kind of power that makes people disappear." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known there were people in town with influence, wealthy businessmen, shady politicians, but he had never imagined they would go this far. Now, everything felt like a conspiracy, a web of secrets and lies he had been blind to for years. "I don't have a choice," Tom said, his voice firm. "They've taken everything from me already. I can't just walk away. I have to find out who's behind this and bring them down." Hank nodded slowly. "All right, I'll help you. But we have to be smart about this. If they're watching you, and I guarantee they are, we can't let them know we're onto them. We need to move quietly, gather information, and figure out who the players are before we make any moves." Tom felt a surge of relief. At least he wasn't completely alone. Hank had always been a good investigator, sharp and methodical. Together, they might stand a chance. "Where do we start?" Tom asked, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Hank scratched his chin, thinking, "First, we need to figure out who's pulling the strings in town. You said Miller hinted at people with real power, right? Well, that means it's not just the department. It's got to be people outside the force. People with money, influence. I'm thinking the usual suspects, developers, politicians, maybe even some of the old families in town." Tom nodded. "I've crossed paths with a few of them over the years. Some of them didn't like the way I handled things, but I never thought they'd go this far." Hank leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Tom, this isn't about a grudge anymore. If they're willing to burn your house down and wipe out your career, they're playing for keeps. This is about control. And whoever's behind it, they want you out of the picture permanently." Tom clenched his fists, the weight of Hank's words sinking in. "Then we'll make them regret it." Hank stood up, determination in his eyes. "We're going to need information, contacts, and a plan. We can't trust anyone in the department, so we'll have to go outside the usual channels. I know a guy, used to be an informant of mine. He's connected to some of the underground dealings in town. If anyone knows what's really going on, it's him." Tom stood as well, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was just the beginning, but at least now he had a direction, a purpose. Hank grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door. "Let's go pay him a visit. It's time to see just how deep this rabbit hole goes." Tom and Hank drove through the winding streets of the town, the streetlights flickering above them like silent witnesses to the dark secrets they were about to uncover. The weight of the last few days hung heavily on Tom's shoulders, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't entirely alone. With Hank at his side, he might just be able to figure out who had burned his house, destroyed his life, and why. As they drove farther from the town center, the buildings became more run down, the streets less traveled. This part of town had always been a haven for those who wanted to stay out of sight. Small-time crooks, hustlers, and people who knew too much for their own good. Tom had patrolled these streets before, but never with the feeling of vulnerability that gnawed at him now. Hank guided the truck down a narrow alley and parked in front of an old, abandoned warehouse. The building was covered in graffiti, its windows broken and its structure decaying from years of neglect. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another forgotten part of town. But Tom knew better. It was a place where deals were made, information exchanged, and sometimes people disappeared. Hank turned to Tom before stepping out of the truck. "The guy we're meeting, he goes by Benny. Used to be in deep with the local gangs, but now he's more of a middleman. He's got connections to all kinds of people, the kind of people who know things they shouldn't. If anyone can point us in the right direction, it's him." Tom nodded, feeling the weight of his badge, even though it didn't mean much anymore. He wasn't sure how much longer he could count on wearing it, or if he even wanted to. The world he was about to step into was one he had always kept at arm's length. Now, it seemed he had no choice but to dive headfirst into the muck. They climbed out of the truck and walked toward the entrance of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, the hinges creaking as Hank pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mildew and old machinery. Broken crates and rusted metal parts littered the floor, but in the center of the room, a faint light flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Benny sat at a small, rickety table, his back turned to them as he fiddled with something in his hands. The man was thin, almost gaunt, with sharp features and dark eyes that darted nervously from side to side. His clothes were worn, his hair greasy and unkempt, but there was an air of sharpness about him, like a rat that had survived too many traps. "Benny," Hank called out as they approached. "We need to talk." Benny jumped slightly, startled by their sudden presence. But when he saw Hank, his tense posture relaxed, slightly. "Hank, man, you scared the hell out of me," Benny muttered, turning to face them. His eyes flicked over to Tom, narrowing slightly as if trying to place him. "And who's this? New partner?" Hank shook his head. "This is Sheriff Tom Davis." Benny raised an eyebrow, his gaze hardening as he studied Tom. "Sheriff, huh? Last I heard, the sheriff's house went up in flames. Funny seeing you here, considering how things have been going." Tom's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not here for small talk, Benny. I'm here for answers. Who's pulling the strings in this town? Why is my life being torn apart? You know something, and I'm here to make sure you tell me." Benny chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "Look, Sheriff, I don't know what you think I can do for you, but you've got the wrong guy. I'm just a man who hears things. I stay out of the way of the big players." Tom took a step closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "You hear things, Benny. That's exactly why I'm here. I don't care how deep this goes. I need to know who's behind this. You give me names, or I swear I'll make sure every person in this town knows you talk to the cops. See how long you last then." Benny's smirk faded, his nervous eyes darting between Tom and Hank. "Easy, Sheriff, easy. No need to get all threatening. I don't want any trouble." Hank stepped forward, his tone calmer but no less firm. "Benny, we're not here to bust you. We're here because you're the only one who can help us. You know how things work around here. If we don't get the information we need, this town's going to eat us alive. That includes you. So, you help us, and maybe we can help you later." Benny ran a hand through his greasy hair, clearly weighing his options. He was a survivor, and like any survivor, he was always calculating the odds. Finally, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Fine, I'll tell you what I know, but you didn't hear it from me. Got it?" Tom and Hank exchanged a glance before Tom nodded. "Just talk." Benny glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening, then lowered his voice. "There's been a shift in town recently. Things have been moving, quietly. Power changing hands, new players coming in. You didn't think the developers were just buying up land because they liked the scenery, did you?" Tom frowned. He had always been suspicious of the sudden influx of money into the town, developers scooping up properties, old businesses being replaced by new ones. But he had never thought it was connected to something more sinister. Benny continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "There's a group with money and influence. They've been pulling strings for a while now, but they've kept it low-key. They control the town council, the cops, hell, even the damn businesses. They decide who stays and who goes. And right now, Sheriff, they've decided you need to go." Tom's blood ran cold. It was worse than he thought. This wasn't just a few corrupt cops or a vendetta. This was a full-blown conspiracy, a shadow organization with its fingers in every part of the town. He had been a thorn in their side, and now they were getting rid of him. "Who are they?" Tom demanded, his voice tense. "Names, Benny. I need names." Benny shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Hank before answering. "I don't know all the players, but there's one name that keeps coming up. Walter Crane. He's the one pulling the biggest strings. Developer, businessman, whatever you want to call him. He's got more money than God, and he's using it to buy his way into power. He's the one you should be worried about." Tom had heard of Walter Crane before. He was one of the wealthiest men in town, known for his large-scale real estate developments. Crane had always kept a low profile, rarely showing his face in public. But now, it seemed he was much more than just a businessman. Benny stood up, wiping his sweaty palms on his pants. "That's all I know. If you're smart, you'll stay away from Crane. People who get too close to him don't last long. Tom looked at Hank, then back at Benny. Thanks for the warning, but I'm not going anywhere. Benny shrugged, backing toward the door. Suit yourself, Sheriff. But don't say I didn't warn you. As Benny disappeared into the shadows, Tom and Hank stood in the empty warehouse, the weight of what they had just learned pressing down on them. Walter Crane, Tom muttered, his mind racing. That son of a... He's behind all this. Hank nodded, his face grim. Looks like we've found our target. Tom clenched his fists, a fire igniting in his chest. They were getting closer to the truth, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Crane wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was the puppet master, and Tom had just entered his game. We'll bring him down, Tom said, his voice filled with determination, no matter what it takes. Hank nodded, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. We're going to need more than just information, Tom. If Crane's as powerful as Benny says, we'll need to be careful. One wrong move and we're done. Tom knew he was right, but he didn't care. They had taken everything from him, and now it was time to take something back. Walter Crane wouldn't see him coming, and when he did, it would be too late. Tom couldn't shake the name Walter Crane from his mind as he and Hank drove back toward town. The man was a ghost, someone who operated in the shadows, using his wealth to bend the town to his will. Tom had known that Crane was a powerful developer, but he never imagined the extent of his influence. Now, he was starting to realize that his fight wasn't just about corrupt officers or a burned-down house. This was bigger, deeper, a fight for the soul of the town itself. As they drove through the quiet streets, Hank broke the silence. You know going after Crane isn't going to be easy, right? Tom clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. I don't care how hard it is. He's the one pulling the strings. He's the reason my house is gone. My job is on the line, and my life is falling apart. Hank nodded slowly. I get that, but Crane's no ordinary criminal. He's got money, influence, and a lot of people in his pocket. You go at him directly, and you'll be hitting a brick wall. Tom let out a deep breath, his anger simmering just below the surface. So what do we do, Hank? Just sit back and let him get away with it? He's already destroyed everything I've worked for. I'm not about to let him win. Hank leaned back in his seat, thinking, no, we don't sit back, but we can't just rush in, guns blazing. We need to be smart. If we're going to take Crane down, we need to know where to hit him. We need leverage, evidence, something that can bring him down without getting ourselves killed in the process. Tom knew Hank was right. Charging straight at Crane would be suicide. But the thought of waiting, of playing a long game, gnawed at him. Every day that passed was another day Crane remained untouchable, free to continue his schemes. Tom didn't want to wait. He wanted justice now. As they drove back to Hank's place, a thought struck Tom. What about the land deals? Crane's been buying up properties all over town. There has to be something there. Something we can use to connect him to all of this. Hank nodded thoughtfully. It's possible. If Crane's involved in something illegal, it's probably tied to those deals. He's been quietly buying up land, but what for? It's not just about money. There's something else going on here. Tom pulled the truck to a stop outside Hank's house. We need to find out what he's planning. If we can dig up dirt on him, something solid, we might have a shot at taking him down. Hank got out of the truck and looked back at Tom. We're going to need help. If we're going to dig into Crane's operations, we need people we can trust, people who aren't already bought off or too scared to get involved. Tom followed Hank inside, his mind racing. Who could they trust? His own department had turned against him, and most of the town's officials were likely under Crane's thumb. They were running out of options. As they sat in Hank's living room, nursing cold beers and staring at the old TV flickering in the corner, Tom's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, frowning. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something told him to answer. Tom Davis, he said, his voice cautious. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice spoke, low, urgent, and unfamiliar. Sheriff Davis, I don't have much time, so listen carefully. I know what happened to your house. I know who's behind it. Tom's pulse quickened. He glanced at Hank, who raised an eyebrow in question. Who is this? How do you know about my house? The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment, then continued. I work for Walter Crane. Or I used to, before I realized what he was really doing. You don't know me, and it's better that way. But I want to help you. Crane isn't just buying land. He's consolidating power. And he'll stop at nothing to make sure anyone who stands in his way is eliminated. Tom gripped the phone tightly. What do you mean? What is Crane planning? The voice lowered even more, barely above a whisper. He's been pushing people out, forcing them to sell their properties, either through intimidation or by cutting deals with local officials. But that's not all. The fire at your house? That wasn't just about getting rid of you. It was a message to anyone else who might try to stand in his way. Tom's blood ran cold. A message? To who? To everyone. Crane wants complete control of the town. And if you get too close to exposing him, you'll end up like the others. I've seen it happen before. But I can help you. I know things that can bring him down. But we have to be careful. He has eyes everywhere. Tom exchanged a glance with Hank, who was listening intently. Why are you telling me this? Why now? The voice on the other end was strained, filled with fear. Because I've seen what happens to people who cross Crane, and I'm tired of living in his shadow. I want out. But if I help you, you have to promise to keep me safe. Tom's heart raced as he considered the implications. This could be the break they needed, the inside information that could finally expose Crane's operation. But it was also a dangerous gamble. Whoever this person was, they were taking an enormous risk by reaching out. You'll be safe, Tom said firmly. But I need more than just words. I need proof, something I can use to take Crane down. The voice hesitated again. I have documents, records of the deals he's made, names of the people he's paid off. But I can't send them electronically. It's too risky. We'll have to meet in person. Tom's mind raced. This was it, the chance to bring Crane down. But it was also a trap waiting to happen. Where? There was a pause before the voice spoke again. There's an old motel on the edge of town, the Ridgeview Motel. Meet me there tomorrow night, 10 p.m. Come alone. And for God's sake, don't tell anyone else. Crane's got ears everywhere. Before Tom could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this mysterious informant? Could they really be trusted? Or was this just another one of Crane's traps? Hank watched him carefully. What was that about? Tom set the phone down, his jaw tight. We might have a way to get to Crane. Someone on the inside. But it's risky. They want to meet tomorrow night. Hank frowned. Sounds like a setup to me. You sure you want to go through with this? Tom shook his head, standing up and pacing the room. I don't know, but we don't have many options left. If this person is telling the truth, they could give us everything we need to take Crane down. Hank sighed, rubbing his temples. You know I've got your back, Tom, but this feels dangerous. Crane's not stupid. If he suspects you're onto him, he'll make his move. Tom stopped pacing and looked at Hank. I know, but I can't walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything that's happened. If this person has proof, I have to see it. I have to take that chance. Hank nodded slowly. All right, but you're not going alone. I'll be there, watching from a distance. If anything goes wrong, I'll step in. Tom felt a surge of gratitude. He wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Thanks, Hank. I appreciate it. As they sat in the dimly lit room, the reality of what they were about to do settled over them. Tomorrow night could be the turning point, the moment they finally uncovered the truth about Crane and his empire. But it could also be the night they lost everything. Tom wasn't sure which way it would go, but one thing was certain. He was ready to face whatever came next. The Ridgeview Motel sat at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The place had a reputation, run down, isolated, and a favorite spot for people who didn't want to be seen. Tom arrived early, parking his truck a block away and walking the rest of the distance. The air was thick with tension, his every step weighed down by the uncertainty of what was to come. Hank had insisted on being nearby, watching from a distance. They had agreed on a plan. Tom would go in alone, but if anything went wrong, Hank would be close enough to intervene. Still, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking straight into a trap. The shadowy informant had given him just enough to lure him here, but what if this was all part of Crane's plan? What if Crane already knew Tom was onto him? He reached the motel, its windows dark except for one, where a dim light flickered through the curtains. That had to be the room. Tom took a deep breath and moved toward the door, his hand resting on the grip of the gun holstered under his jacket. He wasn't taking any chances tonight. As he reached the door of room 12, he knocked softly, glancing around the empty parking lot. No movement, just the sound of crickets in the distance and the faint hum of the motel's buzzing neon sign. After a few seconds, the door creaked open slightly. A man stood in the shadows, his face half hidden in the dim light. He looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "You Davis?" the man whispered, his voice shaky. Tom nodded. "Yeah, you the one who called me?" The man stepped back, motioning for Tom to come inside. "Hurry up, we don't have much time." Tom hesitated for a moment, scanning the room quickly for any signs of danger, then stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, sealing him into the dimly lit, musty-smelling room. The man, who couldn't have been more than 30, looked even more nervous up close. His hands shook as he pulled a chair out for Tom. "Sit," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk fast. I don't know how long I have before someone notices I'm gone." Tom remained standing, his eyes locked on the man. "I'll stand, thanks. Now, who are you? How do you know about Crane?" The man wrung his hands, pacing back and forth. "Name's Ryan. I used to work for Crane, but not in any official capacity, you know? I handled things for him, kept the money flowing, helped move some of his more questionable projects through the town council. I thought I was just helping a businessman, but then I realized Crane's not just a businessman, he's a predator." Tom listened intently, watching the man's every move. "What kind of things are we talking about, Ryan? I need specifics." Ryan stopped pacing, his eyes wide with fear. "Bribery, blackmail, extortion, you name it. He's got half the town's officials in his pocket. And the ones who won't take his money, they disappear. Some get run out of town, others, they just vanish." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just corruption. This was a full-blown criminal empire. "And what about my house? What happened there?" Ryan swallowed hard, looking away. "Crane didn't like how you were poking around. You were getting too close to something he wanted to keep quiet. He sent a message, burned your house to the ground to show you who's in control." Tom's fists clenched at his sides, the anger boiling up inside him. "So it was him. Crane ordered it." Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. I didn't know how far he was willing to go until it was too late." Tom took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Why are you telling me this now? What's changed?" Ryan sighed, collapsing into the chair, burying his face in his hands. "Because I can't keep doing this. Crane's about to make his final move. He's going to seize control of the entire town. The land deals, the bribes, it's all been leading to this. He's planning to redevelop half the town, push out the people who've lived here their whole lives, and turn it into his own private kingdom. If anyone gets in his way, they're dead." Tom's heart raced. This was bigger than he had imagined. Crane wasn't just trying to control the town. He was trying to remake it in his own image, and Tom was standing in his way. "Do you have proof?" Tom asked, his voice hard. "Anything that links him to all of this?" Ryan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive. "Everything's on here. The payments, the deals, the names of the people he's bought off. It's enough to take him down, but you need to be careful. Crane's got eyes everywhere. If he finds out you have this, he'll come after you." Tom took the flash drive, slipping it into his pocket. "Thanks, Ryan. You've done the right thing." Ryan stood up, his face pale. "I don't know if there is a right thing anymore. I just want out of this nightmare." Tom turned toward the door, but before he could reach for the handle, he heard a faint sound, like the crunch of gravel outside. He froze, his instincts kicking in. Something was wrong. "Get down," Tom hissed, pulling Ryan behind the bed as the door suddenly burst open. Gunfire erupted. shattering the window and filling the room with the deafening sound of bullets. Tom ducked behind the bed, his heart pounding. He drew his gun, his mind racing. Who the hell had found them? Ryan was shaking, terror written all over his face. "I told you. He's got people everywhere. They found me." Tom quickly assessed the situation. The gunfire had stopped for a moment, but he knew it wouldn't last. Whoever was outside wasn't going to stop until they were both dead. He motioned for Ryan to stay down, then crawled toward the broken window, peering out into the darkness. Two men were standing by a black SUV, their guns aimed at the motel. They were professionals, cold and efficient. This wasn't some random hit. This was Crane's doing. Tom glanced at the flash drive in his pocket. He had what he needed to bring Crane down, but now it was a matter of survival. He needed to get out of here alive, or everything would be for nothing. The gunfire resumed, ripping through the walls of the motel. Tom fired back, keeping low as he moved toward the door. He had to get to Hank, had to find a way out before it was too late. "Stay here," Tom ordered Ryan, who was cowering behind the bed. "Don't move until I say it's safe." Ryan nodded frantically, his face drenched in sweat. Tom opened the door slightly, just enough to peer out. The gunmen were reloading, giving him a brief window. He slipped out of the room, ducking behind a parked car as bullets whizzed past him. He could see Hank in the distance, crouched behind a dumpster, his gun drawn. Tom motioned to him, signaling that they needed to move. Hank nodded, his eyes sharp and focused. Tom made a break for it, sprinting toward Hank as the gunman fired wildly in his direction. He dove behind the dumpster, breathing heavily. "We need to get out of here," Hank said, his voice tense. "They're not going to stop." Tom nodded, his mind racing. "We've got what we need, but we need to lose them first." Hank glanced around, his eyes narrowing. "There's a back exit behind the motel. We can use it to get to the truck." Tom agreed, but before they could move, more gunfire erupted, pinning them down. Crane's men weren't letting up. The trap had tightened, and Tom was running out of time. They had the proof, but now they had to survive long enough to use it. Tom's breath came in shallow gasps as he and Hank crouched behind the dumpster, bullets ricocheting off the metal around them. They were pinned down, the gunmen relentless in their pursuit. Each second that ticked by felt like an eternity, and Tom knew they had to make a move or they wouldn't make it out alive. "I'll cover you," Hank shouted over the gunfire. "Make for the back exit." Tom nodded, gripping his gun tightly. The flash drive in his pocket felt like it weighed a ton. Everything he had been fighting for rested in that tiny piece of plastic and metal, proof that could finally bring Crane down. But what good would it be if they didn't live to use it? Without wasting another second, Hank jumped up and fired several rounds toward the gunmen, forcing them to take cover. Tom took the opportunity and sprinted toward the back of the motel, keeping low as bullets whizzed past him. He could hear Hank's gun cracking behind him, holding off their attackers. He reached the rear of the building, his heart pounding. There it was, the back exit. A rusty old gate that led into an overgrown alleyway behind the motel. Tom pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. He glanced back to see Hank running toward him, firing one last shot before ducking through the gate. "We need to move," Hank panted, slamming the gate shut behind him. "They'll be on us in no time." Tom nodded, his mind racing. "The truck's a few blocks away. If we can make it there, we have a chance." Together, they sprinted down the narrow alley, their footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls of the buildings around them. The gunfire had stopped, but Tom knew it wouldn't be for long. Crane's men were professionals. They would regroup and come after them, and next time, they wouldn't miss. As they emerged from the alley and onto the dark, empty street, Tom glanced around, scanning for any sign of their pursuers. The streets were eerily quiet, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. For now, it seemed they were in the clear. "We need to get that flash drive somewhere safe," Hank said, his voice low but urgent. "We can't risk going back to my place or yours. Crane's men will tear the whole town apart looking for us." Tom nodded, pulling out his phone and checking the time. It was nearly midnight. "I know a place," he said, his voice steady. There's a small office I used to use back when I was starting out as sheriff. It's in an old building downtown. No one knows about it. We can lay low there and figure out our next move." Hank agreed, and they quickly made their way to the truck, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Once inside, Tom started the engine and peeled away from the curb, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Every nerve in his body was on high alert, expecting Crane's men to come barreling around the corner at any moment. The drive to the office was tense but uneventful. The building Tom had mentioned was an old, nondescript structure, forgotten by time and tucked away in a quiet corner of downtown. They parked the truck in an alley behind the building and slipped inside, making their way up the creaky wooden stairs to the small office on the second floor. The room was dusty, with old files and papers scattered across the desk. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering glow. Tom locked the door behind them and pulled the flash drive from his pocket, setting it down on the desk. Hank let out a long breath and sank into a chair. "We made it. For now." Tom nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. They had the evidence they needed to expose Crane, but getting it out into the open was another matter entirely. Crane had connections everywhere, people in positions of power, people who would do anything to protect him. "We need to be smart about this," Tom said, pacing the small room. "If we go to the local authorities, it'll get buried. Crane's got too many people in his pocket." Hank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "What about the state police? They're not tied to this town. If we can get this to someone outside of Crane's reach, we might have a chance." Tom considered it, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Yeah, that could work. But we need to make sure we don't tip our hand. If Crane catches wind that we're going to the state police, he'll send every man he's got after us." Just as the plan began to take shape, Tom's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from an unknown number. His stomach dropped as he read the words on the screen. "We know where you are. You can't run forever, Sheriff." Tom's blood ran cold. Crane had found them. They were being hunted, and now it was only a matter of time before Crane's men showed up at the door. "We need to move," Tom said, his voice tight with urgency. "They know where we are. We can't stay here." Hank jumped up, grabbing the flash drive and stuffing it into his pocket. "What's the plan?" Tom's mind raced. They needed to get out of town, fast, and get the flash drive into the hands of someone who could actually do something with it. But with Crane's men closing in, every second counted. "We head for the state police headquarters," Tom said, his voice steady. "It's a couple hours drive, but if we can make it there, we'll be safe. They won't be able to touch us." Hank nodded, but before they could move, they heard the sound of tires screeching outside. Tom rushed to the window and peeked through the blinds. His heart sank. Two black SUVs had pulled up outside the building, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "They're here," Tom whispered, backing away from the window. "We need to go now." Hank nodded, already moving toward the door. But before they could make it out, the front door of the building burst open and heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs. Tom and Hank exchanged a look, both knowing what they had to do. There was no time to run. They had to stand and fight. Tom pulled his gun from its holster and took a deep breath. "Ready?" Hank nodded, his face grim. "Let's do this." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Tom steadied his aim, his finger hovering over the trigger. This was it, the final showdown. One way or another, it all ended tonight. The door to the office slammed open, and Crane's men stormed in, guns raised. Tom and Hank opened fire, the small room exploding into chaos. The flash of muzzle fire lit up the darkness, and the deafening roar of gunshots filled the air. Tom moved quickly, taking cover behind the desk as bullets tore through the walls. Hank fired from the corner of the room, his shots precise. But there were too many of them. As Tom fired back, he saw one of the gunmen go down, but another quickly took his place. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. Just when it seemed like there was no way out, Tom heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, and the gunman hesitated, glancing toward the street. The state police had arrived. Someone must have heard the gunfire and called for backup. Crane's men, realizing they were out of time, began to retreat, rushing down the stairs and disappearing into the night. The room fell silent, the only sound the distant wail of sirens. Tom collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. They had made it. Barely. Hank looked over at Tom, blood trickling from a graze on his arm. "We did it," he said, his voice shaky. "We made it." Tom nodded, but the victory felt hollow. Crane was still out there, still in control. They had survived the night, but the fight wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until Crane was behind bars, and the town was free from his grip. As the state police burst into the room, guns drawn, Tom held up his hands in surrender, the flash drive still safely tucked in his pocket. "We have the proof," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "It's all on here. Everything you need to bring him down." The officer nodded, taking the flash drive from Tom's hand. "We'll take it from here, Sheriff. You've done enough." Tom leaned back against the wall, exhausted but determined. He had done what he could. Now it was up to the system to finish the job. But as the state police led him and Hank out of the building, Tom couldn't help but wonder, would justice finally be served? Or had Crane already woven his web too tightly around the town? Only time